Welcome to this workshop discussing the Bureau of Land Management's Public Lands Rule. Let me be clear that I do not represent the Bureau of Land Management. Rather, I'm presenting on behalf of a coalition of conservation organizations that work in Colorado and beyond. Let me introduce myself. I'm Allison Galinsky. My pronouns are she, her. I work for Rocky Mountain Wild, which is a conservation organization that works to protect biodiversity in Colorado and the greater southern Rocky Mountain region. I'm a conservation geographer, and that means I use mapping and geographic analysis to support our community protecting wildlife and wild lands. I respectfully acknowledge that the land I am speaking from is the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute nations. I also acknowledge the 48 contemporary tribal nations historically tied to the lands that comprise what is now called Colorado, but who live in the American Southwest, the Great Plains, and the Rocky Mountain region. In offering this land acknowledgement, I affirm Indigenous sovereignty, history, knowledge, and experiences. I appreciate the help of Wild Connections, Great Old Broads for Wilderness and Environment Colorado in supporting this presentation and for the great work they do for conservation in the region. Finally, I would like to introduce Rocky Smith, an expert in Forest Service policy with amazing skills at reading and analyzing federal agency documents. He has reviewed the proposed rule in depth and will be helping out with the details of the rule. This presentation and workshop today will have the following parts. We're starting with a high-level overview of the rule. Then I'm going to discuss a major outcome, I hope, that comes from this presentation, which is that many of you will submit comments on this rule. Then I'm going to go into more depth on the rule, and you can think about the discussion of the rule in depth as you're planning what you're going to say in your comments. And by wrapping this up, hoping to finish up in about an hour. But if the discussion goes a little bit longer than that, I'll make sure that I wrap up first and then go back for people who would like to stay a little longer. So what is the Public Lands Rule, and how does it fit into the federal rulemaking process? This is information provided by the Bureau of Land Management. Much of this presentation is based on information that they provided. The proposed Public Lands Rule establishes a framework that basically puts conservation of healthy landscapes, of wildlife habitat, of clean water at an equal footing with other uses of the Bureau of Land Management lands. This would continue to uphold the Bureau of Land Management's multiple use and sustained yield mission, but also bringing a stronger focus in their high-level rules to the conservation aspects of the management. And this would help guide responsible development and safeguard important places. And this is, as many of you know, especially important as we're facing the dual crises of climate change and decline in biodiversity. This infographic was created by the Bureau of Land Management to help explain the major components of this proposed rule. They divided this up into three aspects. One is to focus on protecting intact, healthy landscapes. Another component is to identify landscapes that are not as healthy and to restore them back to health. And both of these aspects help to increase the resiliency of the land in the face of climate change and to promote biodiversity. And finally, they are raising up their existing efforts to promote decision making based on science and to increase their use of Indigenous knowledge in making decision making. How does this all fit in? What they're creating is a rule. This is not causing any changes in how things are managed on the ground at this time. It is informing how they will be planning for management in the future. This is all ties back to the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, which was initially established in 1976 and has been revised over the years. That's also known as FLPMA. And the information about this rule spends a lot of time talking about how this rule fits into the existing framework of FLPMA and how it fills in gaps in this rule. And right now we're in the public comment period on this proposed rule, which was shared with the public initially on April 30th. And they are collecting public comments on the rule until June 20th, which is next Tuesday. Then they will review the tens of thousands of comments that they're receiving. They will update the rule and they will put it into effect. There is a bit of a deadline on this because they need to get this rule into effect before the last days of the current presidential administration, because if it goes into effect, if it's finalized too late in the administration, then it can be overturned very easily in a future administration. So how can you learn more about this rule? Let me put these links into the chat. And also, we will be sending this information out to everyone who registered for this presentation. So be patient with me while I put all of this into the chat. The first link is a series of very useful information from the Bureau of Land Management on this rule. There's frequently asked questions, there's infographics that I've incorporated into this presentation. There's a presentation that they've made at several public meetings. There's links to how to comment from there. I'd also like to bring your attention to a website that a coalition of conservation organizations put together, actnowforpubliclands.org. They also have information about the rule, resources, support for the rule, and I'll talk a little bit about their comment portal as well. If you're like Rocky and like to dig into the details, there's a link on regulations.gov that has the text of the rule, that has it in the Federal Register notice, which also has a lot of background on the rule, and it has explanations for how the rule was put together. For your information, it took me a while to figure this out, but the rule itself is towards the end of the document.
Yeah, that's standard procedure and rules. There's nothing different there.
Thank you. Yes, you had, as I mentioned, that's Rocky, and he has spent a lot more time than I have in reviewing Federal Register notices. And there's also a link here for how to comment on the rule. All of these web pages have links to the comment portal. Okay, as I mentioned, what I'm really hoping people take away out of this presentation is the importance of commenting on this rule. Why should you comment? The most important reason is to show your support for conservation, for bringing for putting conservation on equal footing with other uses of the land that the Bureau of Land Management manages. This is really important because there are forces that want to leave things the way they are, where uses like oil and gas development, like mining, like cattle grazing on our public lands are elevated over other uses, such as promoting biodiversity through healthy landscapes. The Bureau of Land Management is not promoting that conservation should be at a higher level than these uses, but they do want it to be at an equal footing with these other uses.
Yeah, they say that in the rule preamble.
Yes.
And they also, if you look at FLPMA is pretty clear that the BLM is supposed to manage its lands for all the uses. You can specifically cite, I looked this up this morning, section 102A8, 102A8 of FLPMA. That says you manage for all the uses, and it mentions just about all the uses you can think of. And so this is just getting in what should have already been in practice, but hasn't been, or at least not very much. So you might note that in your comments. I think that's really important. The opposition to this rule, and there's been a lot of it already, is just what Allison just said. People want to keep it the same way as it's always been because they dominate through grazing, mining, oil and gas development, etc. And this is a start in sending it back to where it should be under the law. So keep that in mind.
Absolutely. There's a lot of information in the Federal Register notice about how this all fits into the current framework. The opposition is trying to present this as something that maybe goes against the law, and that's fake news. It's completely inaccurate. This all fits in with the current framework, and it will make things better for all users of our public lands. So, writing comments. Some important guidance on this. Please be respectful when you write your comments. The Bureau of Land Management is going to be spending a lot of time going through all the comments, and they are required to look at every single one. They're going to take a lot more seriously comments where people are respectful. They're going to be better able to use comments where people get to the point quickly, where they're on topic. One thing that I always say when I'm telling people to write comments is to write in your own words. That is always important. It's important this time. However, there are good templates that already exist, and there's nothing wrong, especially with all the comments that are being already being written, to basically signing on to one of these existing templates. If that's what you have time for, you can go to the Act Now for Public Lands and just enter the exact same words they have. The reason we say to write in your own words is when you eh, submit a comment that's identical to another one, the agency looks through and says, okay, there were 10,000 comments that were identical. We don't have to review everyone in particular, but we also, that also gives them the information that 10,000 people are supporting this rule and supporting conservation. And that will help balance out if there's 5,000 people who put in the exact same comment to support the oil and gas industry. Finally, there's a link here, a tiny URL called Sticky Comments. That's a guide that Rocky Mountain Wild put together a while back on writing comments. That's a general guide, and the details of that are really useful for when you're writing comments on any topic. This is an opportunity, if this is maybe the first time you've submitted comments, just to get your feet wet to see what that process is like. And then when you're engaging in something that doesn't have tens of thousands of people engaging, you'll have an opportunity to dig even deeper. Some of you have probably written many comments before, and if this can help you, if this session helps you figure out what to write in this case, that's great too.
Yeah,
So
one more thing. Don't be intimidated. Just because you don't know or think you don't know much about this, go ahead and write some comments anyway, if you can, and personalize them. You know, if you want to use a template like Allison just explained, that's all you have time for, that's fine. But try to write a personal letter. It needn't be long, or make it as long as you want, depending on how much time you want to take to spend on this. And if you use BLM lands for anything, for hiking, hunting, fishing, driving for pleasure, bird watching, nature study, state that. I am so-and-so, and I reside in so-and-so, and I regularly visit the BLM lands and maybe list a few of them. And I really enjoy this, and I want a rule that's going to protect all of that, or something like that. And then, you know, if you want to get into details, that's fine. If you want to really get into details, hire a nerd like me. You don't have to pay me anything to do it. Anyway, just write some comments, and don't think that it won't matter, because it very well might. If you don't write, that's one piece of input the BLM doesn't get, and that makes it that tiny bit much harder to get a good final rule. So please write if you are so inclined.
yes, thank you very much. And thank you, Rocky. That's really good advice. And here are the link. These are links that I already shared that I put into the chat and that we'll send out to all the people who registered. Remember, the deadline is Tuesday. That's after the Juneteenth holiday. You do have until the end of the day Tuesday. You could go ahead and start thinking about this right after this session. Act Now for Public Lands.org has a way to submit comments. They will make sure that all of the people who submit comments through their portal, that they get submitted through this official portal through the Federal Register. Or you can go directly to the Federal Register. If you do submit your comments directly and you want to let me know that you submitted comments, that would be great, so that the coalition has an idea of how many people submitted comments. But yeah, the most important thing is to submit your comments to show your support for putting conservation on an equal footing with other uses, your support with fully supporting the FLPMA law. Okay, at this point, if anyone has any questions about what I've talked about so far, I'll give folks a chance to put them into the chat, or you could come off mute if you'd like to And thank you everyone again for joining. And if folks are not able to see the chat, we had a question earlier to cite the FLPMA section that lists the uses of public lands. And Rocky responded to that. It's section 102A and the number 8. Okay, I'm going to now get into a little bit more detail. I do encourage not just Rocky, but anyone on who has dug into this rule to chime in as I'm going through, because I got my information by going to Bureau of Land Management virtual meeting and skimming the rule document at a high level and listening to other people's analysis, but I'm definitely not an expert. These next slides are basically excerpts from the presentation that the Bureau of Land Management did at their virtual and in-person meetings. And their full slide deck is available on the Bureau of Land Management webpage on the Public Lands Rule. They divided up this rule, as I mentioned before, into 3 topics, primary topics. So let's start with protecting intact landscapes. So the purpose of this part of the rule is to maintain and protect areas that have high ecological values, because those areas will have the highest ecological resilience. So it's places that are not fragmented, places that support the native wildlife, the native plants that and are not broken up, or not do not have invasive species dominating. One of the primary mechanisms that is defined in FLPMA are called areas of critical environmental concern, and this rule helps to better define the procedures for nominating and selecting these ACECs. One technical change they've made is in the past, in order for them to protect an area of critical environmental concern, they used to require that it had more than local significance, which was fairly unclear what that meant, and it seemed to be used primarily to deny nominations for areas of critical environmental concern.
Yeah. Are you through, Allison? I have a bunch to say about this, but
yes.
Okay. FLPMA already says that field units need to emphasize ACECs in identifying them and maybe protecting them. This language, this I think is one of the better parts of the rule, and it's a good rule overall, although it has some shortcomings, which we'll talk about, makes it even more clear. It gives even more emphasis. It allows, first of all, ACECs are defined in FLPMA as areas that need special management attention, or where special management attention is required to protect. Then it lists a bunch of values, all the ones that Allison just mentioned and some others. It does allow people to suggest during scoping comments, like for when you're having a plan revision or amendment or a new plan for a new unit. I don't think it'd be a new PLM unit, but the public can suggest, hey, make this an ACEC. And it requires that in the environmental impact statement that accompanies the resource management plan, that one alternative look at all the possible ACECs, not all the possible ones, but all the ones that might possibly be designated. It also, I think, makes it harder to undesignate an ACEC, although there's a little bit of weakness in one of those, I think. But overall, this is good. So if you're commenting, you might, if you don't want to dig into the details, just say ACECs are a good thing. The rule makes them easier to designate. Make that part of the rule final or something like that. It's a good thing.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm actually trying to order this by going through the pieces that I find of the rule that I find the most positive, and then getting to the parts that are harder to understand or more controversial further on. Intact landscapes. The Bureau of Land Management has found a number of different ways to describe these kinds of lands. Lands with wilderness characteristics probably means something very similar. They've found a way to say this without using the wilderness word that has become problematic. That's my take on this. They never said that in their presentations. However, I think it's very important that they continue to inventory their lands. They continue to identify the places that are the most intact, that will provide the best protection for the land against the changing climate, against development pressures, and not just to identify, well, first step to identify these, and then to figure out ways to maintain their intactness, to maintain the resilience.
Yeah, they use maintain and restore in the actual rule, and they are this rule, if we're final, would directs the or would direct the BLM field units to identify intact landscapes in planning. Now, intact landscapes could, at least some of them could be ACECs, but probably not all of them will be. I think this is a pretty good provision of the rule. It's, not super strong, but the fact that it's in there at all for BLM is a big advance, okay? So this is another thing you would want to support, to tell BLM, please do protect intact landscapes in your planning, and identify them and protect, and also, where appropriate, restore them.
And I'm going to skip over, I'm going to go in a different order than they went in their presentation. I'm going to go talk about the wise decision-making component. This is somewhat technical, but I think that this is a good component as well. It's working to apply the existing standards across all lands, across all uses of the lands. Right now, from what I understand, the standards are different depending on whether the land's being used for grazing, which I think has more specific standards than if the land's being used for oil and gas development, if the land is being used for intense recreation. Yes, please go
sorry,
ahead.
I didn't mean to interrupt, but right now, the BLM is only required to apply land health standards for grazing. This rule, and this is another good provision of this rule, would require the BLM to apply it across the board to everything. And unlike most of the rest of the rule, it takes effect immediately. Most of this rule, this is one of the weaknesses of it, would only apply once land management plans, resource management plans, are revised or significantly amended. This one takes effect right away, or if this rule were in effect today, would it take effect right away? They have to use the existing standards. In other words, the ones they develop for grazing. And I've got the Colorado ones. If anyone's interested, I can email them to you. They're pretty good. They're kind of general, but they're, as far as they go, they're pretty good. The BLM would have to apply them to all of their activities, including oil and gas, which has a tremendous effect on the BLM lands where it's done. And then they would have to examine them when they next revised the plan or significantly amended it and update them. So this is yet another good provision of this rule, and that's something that you might want to commend the BLM for, and make sure they keep that in the final version of the rule.
Thank you, Rocky. And there's one program that they've put into place in the last, I don't know exactly when they started, it's called their Assessment, Inventory, and Monitoring Strategy, or AIM. That data is publicly available. I've spent a little bit of time looking at it. I think it's a great program. As with most things that the Bureau of Land Management does, that all the public land management agencies do, they don't have enough staff to do all the monitoring that they would really need to do so that's always a weakness. So supporting additional funding for these agencies is also a good thing to do, but beyond the scope of what we're talking about today. There are a few good comments that are in the chat, so let me go ahead and look at that and read those for people who might not know how to look at the chat when the slides are up. So Ron mentioned, as already noted, environmental concerns appear equal to other resources in FLPMA. So what can be incorporated into the rule to keep things from continuing as always? BLM has, since FLPMA, just about always approved extractive applications, justifying it by applying mitigations. We will be talking about mitigation in a moment. This rule is not perfect in addressing environmental concerns as they should be according to FLPMA, but it's a great step in the right direction. So supporting the rule really helps to move into this. Let me also put Rocky's email address. Rocky, why don't you read out your email address?
Sure. My email is the number 2, Rock, R-O-C-K, W, Smith, 2RockWSmith@gmail.com. And Ellen, I see that you have a request here for the public land health standards. I will get those to you after we're done. It'd be hard to do it right now. So if you can be patient for a little while longer, I'll email them to you.
And then Ron also commented that the BLM has always intended to maintain intact lands. ACECs have been a tool for decades. We too easily frame a nice looking commitment and feel relieved. Oil and gas sites have measures to preserve and or restore for decades. So what Ron is pointing out, I believe, and please, you can go off mute or put more comments in if I'm misinterpreting you, is that the framework for this has been in place for a long time, but has led to extractive industries being favored and to the degradation of these lands. And again, this rule is not perfect. This rule is nice looking words, but I think it's a really important step in the direction of having a more conservation oriented mindscape for the industry.
Yeah, I agree with that. And this isn't going to solve all the problems of BLM in one fell swoop. Even its land, even its rule, were final tomorrow and applied right away. And again, one of the weaknesses of it is that it only, or most of it is only going to apply when the BLM revises its plans. It's a start. I guess that's all I can say. We can ask that the rule be strengthened to really emphasize the ecological aspects of BLM's land management and ask that some of the provisions, or maybe just about all of them, be put in effect right away, but then updated as the plans are revised or significantly amended. I acknowledge the concern that the agencies can really twist stuff. I mean, we face this all the time with Forest Service and the BLM. You know, they've got some stuff in their regulations and laws like FLIPMA that says you got to manage it all, you know, all the uses together in a sustained yield type of fashion, and they don't do it. And that's because, you know, there's the appropriations process, the people in the agencies, in the middle and upper levels of it at least, you know, often come from a resource extraction background. This is a real bad thing in the Forest Service right now. And it's the same with the BLM. And there's not much we can do about that. We can just try to get through this process, get a good, strong rule, and hope that it is implemented. And over time, the BLM maybe will no longer be the Bureau of Livestock and Minerals or the Bureau of Bovine Leasing and Management, and really be a Bureau of Land Management that really takes care of the land. It's about all we can do. The fact that you are a little bit cynical about that, I don't blame you one bit, but let's just try to do what we can to make it better.
Okay, there are a couple of questions that have come in about mitigation, and I'm going to get to that, but I would like to first address Jean's comment on the use or misuse of ORVs on public lands has great negative environmental impacts. How might the new rule better control ORV use? So I can think of a couple of aspects of this rule. As areas are identified as areas of critical environmental concern, as area intact landscapes are identified and protected, those areas might become off limits to ORV use, or might limit the use to existing trails, as is done on Forest Service lands. There's also, when we get into mitigation, there are rules around figuring out what the impacts would be and figuring out ways to minimize them first. Finally, the going back to the monitoring. This rule is putting in place land health standards that impact recreational use and not just grazing use.
Yeah, go ahead, Allison. I didn't mean to.
No, I'm pretty much done. So
Okay,
Right.
I'll just add, just to pile on to that. The public land health standards that the BLM has to start applying right away include a couple of things that might apply to ORV use. So fully functioning watersheds. If you've got, you know, vehicles crossing, you know, unauthorized routes going, you know, up and down a stream, sometimes literally, or crossing in a lot of places, that would be a landscape that would be a candidate for restoration. There's also a public land health standards required on ecological processes. And if you have, you know, a watershed that's really messed up, well, you're lacking good processes there. And water quality and compliance with state water quality standards. That's the third public land health standards. And another one, the fourth one, habitat for special status species. Some species don't do well in the presence of motor vehicles. Very few do, in fact. So while this rule does not directly address ORVs, it does address several things that could be applied to limit ORV use. Now, of course, they can limit it all they want if they don't have enforcement officers out there. You know, it doesn't go into effect very well, but I see this rule as possibly helping with that. And I know it's a big problem, and we'll just have to do the best we can with it.
right, and within their mandate, ORV use is one of the multiple uses. So figuring out the most appropriate places for that experience is an important part of what the Bureau does. One more thing that I think is pretty good step for this agency, and being part of the Department of Interior led by Deb Holland, who's a Native American, is working more to get information from the tribes, from the people who have millennia of experience with these lands, and having better ways to manage the lands through tribal co-stewardship when appropriate, to doing better outreach to the tribes to get their input. And very interesting thing that has started to happen is using the indigenous knowledge, using the knowledge of people who've been on these lands and have been managing these lands for millennia, especially lands that are less populated, and including that in the decision-making process. And I think this is also an important step forward.
I agree.
And then this is just a little graphic about how they would do decision-making. Finally, going to restoration, where we're going to be talking about mitigation. We'll be talking about the rather confusing aspect of this rule called conservation leasing. So I think one of the other good part of this is that they are directed to identify and prioritize areas for restoration. So areas that have been degraded through the ongoing uses of the land, and identifying ways that those can be restored.
They have to do that every 5 years, by the way, at least once every 5 years. That's another good provision of the rule. They got to look at that, and every resource management plan has to have a restoration plan. And they are directed to, with this rule, again, it's not final yet, but they would be directed, is to see where they can prevent undue or unnecessary degradation. In other words, that's kind of preventative. Restore what's already messed up and prevent other stuff from getting messed up. That's good.
And I think they are acknowledging that they can use help with this, that they do not have the resources and the staff to do this all themselves. They already restore lands. They already work with other groups to restore lands. They're putting into place something new, a new term that they call conservation leasing. And specifically, this is setting us up a framework for working with other groups to restore land or to do mitigation. My impression, and again, this is just me, and it's not anything they said officially, is that this is really focused on the idea of off-site mitigation, as Polly pointed out. So let me read a couple of comments on this. Could you give an example of off-site mitigation? On-site is generally better. Another one is a concern with off-site mitigation if 90% of lands are open to extraction and high percentage to grazing, where will BLM find the plans to mitigate unavoidable degradation? So part of the rule is that if there are going to be impacts to the land, that first of all, they should try to do mitigation by avoiding the impacts. So if they can find a way to support these multiple uses that they're required to support without impacting the land, if they could do oil and gas extraction in areas that are already damaged where they're not going to damage it further, then that should be their priority. If they're going to be doing this work, then those areas should be restored as as the work is happening. If they're going to have a intensive recreation area, then figure out ways to avoid damaging resources. The idea of offsite mitigation is if they've determined that in order to support intensive recreation in one area, that is going to reduce the habitat for pronghorn, then maybe there's an area nearby that they've identified for restoration, and they would, through this mitigation aspect of conservation leasing, the organizations that are supporting recreation could pay for the lands to become more suitable for pronghorn somewhere else. So I believe that's an example. And that there already are mitigation activities like this going on, and I believe they're trying to put in a framework for that. Rocky,
Yeah.
I'd appreciate your help on this because I
I
know.
was just going to chime in, Allison. Okay, the mitigation hierarchy, and it doesn't just apply to conservation leasing. Conservation leasing is a whole nother thing. If we have time, I want to spend a minute or two on that because that's a screwy part of this rule. But anyway, back to mitigation. The mitigation hierarchy is avoid the impacts to the greatest extent possible, as Allison described. Second is minimize. Okay, you're going to have impacts, make them less. That might involve, for an oil and gas lease, for example, say no surface occupancy lease, and you put the surface part of that operation in on a land that is already disturbed, whereas right, where underneath it you're taking the oil and gas out, that isn't disturbed. And then the third part is compensation. The example of compensatory mitigation, as it is called, that I'm most familiar with is wetland creation, where you have some kind of under the 404B1 program, under the Clean Water Act, where you're expected to find a less damaging alternative, but you can't do that for a non-water dependent project. Sometimes they order compensatory mitigation, which involves trying to create a wetland somewhere else. Well, there's not a wetland that's somewhere else because there isn't meant to be. So it's not good. And that's why it's at the bottom of the hierarchy, at the very lowest point, because you want to try to avoid or minimize rather than compensate. But if you can't fully avoid or minimize, then compensation is in most cases going to be better than nothing. But Sally's comment, where will BLM find the lands to mitigate unavoidable degradation? Very good question. There's some BLM lands that are pretty hammered. You might not be able to find one. But again, the other parts of this rule conserve intact landscape. So conserve what you got, restore what you can restore to an intact landscape, maybe. Maybe that will help. And again, this rule is not going to solve everything, but it's a start and we should generally support it.
Yes, I guess my interpretation is a lot of the mitigation could be done by going after the places where restoration needs to happen. So instead of trying to create a wetland where there wasn't one, it would look at an area that had been a wetland where whatever was going on to degrade it isn't happening anymore and restoring it. So
yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
Here's a little bit about conservation leasing, and let's try to maybe spend 5 minutes on that and then wrap up. So Rocky, please share your thoughts on conservation.
Okay. The idea that BLM would lease land for conservation instead of for livestock grazing, oil and gas leasing, oil and gas production, or some mining or something else is intriguing. I've never seen anything like this before. The problem I have with it is that when you read the draft rule language, it comes off like a standard lease. In other words, someone leasing for conservation. First of all, let me see if I can find the definition of conservation. I don't have it exactly here, but it's basically maintain resilience, functioning ecosystems, and do that by protecting or restoring natural habitat and ecological functions. So anyway, someone applying for a conservation lease would have to do something that fit in with that framework. Okay. Not necessarily a bad thing, but as I said, the draft language in the draft rule reads like a standard lease. Someone wanting a lease for conservation would have to pay the BLM for doing that. They would have to put down a bond. It's like they're leasing it for something that they're going to make a profit out of, but they're probably not going to make a profit because who is going to pay them to do a lease? Now, you might find somebody that, with a rich conservation group like Nature Conservancy, for example, or some others. I can't think of them right now. There might be a few that could, just would want to do it, be a good guy, a good actor, and go out there, get a conservation lease and repair some land. That would be good. They pay for it themselves, and they pay the BLM for the privilege of doing it. Therefore, because of that, I do not see this as being practical. That's not to say it's bad. It just seems, I've just scratched my head over and say, who would apply for a conservation lease? Maybe somebody would, I don't know. But it just seems impractical to me.
And my impression is that it's really targeted towards the mitigation. So who's paying for it is an extractive industry that wants to do compensatory mitigation. So they pay to lease the land, and then they bring in an organization that has experience with restoration to restore this land to make up for the fact that some other land is continued to be degraded. That, to me, seems like the most practical experience to this.
That's a good point, Allison, but here's my response to that. If somebody needs to do some kind of mitigation as part of a lease, let's say because of oil and gas lease and they trash the land, and oil and gas leasing is a very high impact use of land, then that should be part of their oil and gas lease, not a separate lease. Why make them apply for a separate lease, which would be voluntary? The BLM couldn't say, all right, you gotta do a conservation lease and you gotta pay us to do it. No, the BLM should say, as part of your oil and gas lease, you clean it up, buddy. You do compensatory mitigation if we need you to. So that's, I don't know. It's just weird to me. Maybe I'm off on maybe I'm been smoking something, but no, I haven't. I don't know.
I think they're getting a lot of pushback on this, and let me address with this new slide Christina's question. Would conservation leasing make it possible to buy out grazing and oil and gas leases?
No,
absolutely not. Correct.
no, it's very explicit in the rule. I think it's in the rule language itself. It's definitely in the preamble, part of the Federal Register notice that you can read, that says that conservation leasing will not replace other leasing, and it is not used, will not be used as a way of keeping something from happening on land. So that raises another potential problem for conservation leasing. If somebody gets a conservation lease, something else could happen on land that could negate the conservation, although there's something in the rule about they're not supposed to lease, have another use on land that is leased for conservation that would contradict the lease or affect the lease. I don't know. It just is a whole weird thing.
In the presentations from the Bureau of Land Management, they seem to be really focusing on these leases are only for restoration or mitigation. The language in the rule seemed to also suggest protection, but they seem to be really pushing against that. So, and they did acknowledge that the term conservation was used in a broader form in other parts of the rule. They're actually asking for, is there a better term for this? And if really what this is framework for compensatory mitigation, then that's probably what they should call it. However, if even Rocky is having trouble understanding this, then for sure, I am as well. Okay, let's go ahead and wrap up, but then spend a little bit of that time at the end for some more questions and to get back to this. So again, these are the links that I put into the chat earlier and that we will send out. BLM.gov/public-lands-rule is a very good resource on this. actnowforpubliclands.org is a conservation take on this. And then there are links to regulations.gov and the Federal Register. Regulations.gov is the direct link for commenting, and the federalregister.gov link is for the text of the rule. And the comment deadline on this is Tuesday, June 20th. They have so many comments coming in that they are very unlikely to look at anything that comes in after the 20th.
And they don't have to either under their rules. So if your
Yes.
comments are late, they will probably be ignored.
I do want to once again thank the organizations that sponsored this webinar, and here are the links to Rocky Mountain Wild, Wild Connections, Great Old Broads for Wilderness, and to Environment Colorado. And all of us are doing really good work, and we can't do it without your support. I want to also thank the Bureau of Land Management for making a lot of really nice photographs available on Flickr through Creative Commons. And thank you for joining. Now let me allow people, if they are have other things to do, to go ahead.
Allison, we got a question, a burning question here from Ellen. Please answer my question. How about not renewing grazing licenses as they expire? That'd be fine with me. I don't think the BLM would put anything like that in a rule, because if you talk about opposition to this draft rule, and there's already a lot of it, and it's intense, that would really, blow it off the scale. And I don't think, again, conservation leasing is specifically not for terminating one lease. If grazing has so messed up the land, and in many cases it probably has, almost certainly has, then it should be a candidate for restoration, and the BLM just has to find the moxie, the guts to tackle that. When you go up against the livestock industry, the meat industry, or any other industry, it's tough. And then if the BLM doesn't do what they want, they run to their congressman, say, "Oh, the BLM is beating up on poor little me," and you know what happens. We get stuff like we got with the budget, the recent budget bill, or the debt bill. We got some horrible NEPA revisions of NEPA, and that could happen if the BLM tries to make the rule too strong. As much as we'd like to see them terminate a lot of grazing leases, particularly on land that's been degraded, I don't think it's going to happen through this rule. I don't see it, except that they could identify lands for restoration and do it that way, and that might happen if this rule becomes final, which for a number of reasons it may not.
So Nick has a good question. What are things that we might want to add to comments for BLM's consideration in general, in addition to general support for the proposed rule? I do suggest that you go out to the web pages for the organizations. I know that that Great Old Broads, for example, has some good suggestions on their web page, some talking points. Some things that have come up is that so a lot of the provisions of this don't go into effect until until a revision to or amendment to a resource management plan, and asking for some of the provisions to go into effect sooner, or to prioritize, for example, the review and designations of areas of critical environmental concern, to better define the conservation leasing process, to prioritize on-site mitigation instead of off-site mitigation. Rocky, do you have some suggestions?
I think those are all very good. Try to, I think you said this, Allison, but I want to re-emphasize it. Get these provisions for restoration, ecosystem resilience, mitigation, get them in effect before the plans are revised, and have the plans definitely look at all of them. But, you know, get them in effect before that. In other words, still, you don't have to wait for revision, because one of the ways, there's a number of ways the BLM could subvert application of this rule or implementation of it. And one of them is just by delaying plans revision. The FLIPMA provision, or it's actually in the regulations, at the 1600 something regulations, gives the BLM quite a bit of discretion about when they revise plans. Unlike the Forest Service, which is supposed to do it every 15 years, ha, ha, ha. The BLM does not have a time limit when they must revise, just says basically whenever they feel like it, or whenever there's data. So it could be, in other words, a long time before anything, before at least some of the plans are revised. Ones that say had a revision 3 or 4 years ago, the BLM say, oh no, we're not going to, you know, bother with that now. We're going to wait forever. We don't have the money, blah, blah, blah. So I think that's an important thing. And basically, you know, right, that you want them to maintain the strong provisions like the public land health standards, the ACECs, the restoration, and you know, and get them in effect early. And I think those are the things to emphasize to improve the rule.
And let me put in into the chat. This is the direct link to enter comments through regulations.gov. I do suggest that you write your comments in advance and then cut and paste them into here, or attach a file just in case you have some issue when you're trying to submit comments and the web page crashes. It's really frustrating if you just type them to the comment form and then they go away. They'll ask how to get follow-up information on the final status of the rule. There are ways to sign up for notifications from the Bureau of Land Management. I'll put into my notes to try to get some of those links out to folks. That's you know, that's really the best way to get updates. There is a press release site, but there's a whole lot of stuff there. So
yeah, they can also, if you're on the Circle All listserv, or even if you're not, you know, once a final rule comes out, let's say a final rule comes out sometimes next year, you're going to hear about it. It'll be out there. And you know, if you want to get directly notified, if you want to get directly notified, then do what Allison said, you know, sign up. But you'll find out about it. It'll be big news. The national groups will put it out. And so you'll find out. And it's also possible that I think that this rule is getting so much negative flack that the BLM is going to chicken out, and they might redo a draft, you know, put out a presumably weaker new draft rule. If they do that, you'll hear about that too. So anyway, just keep your eyes and ears open, or sign up to get the direct notification, as Allison said.
okay, well, we're well past our, well, just a little bit past our hour. Thank you everyone for coming. We'll stop the recording now.